Hi, I'm Cathi Bond, and first of all, I identify as she or her. And the period of time I'm going to focus on is the history of the establishment of the lesbian scene from about 1975 into the early 80s. Now, I want you to know I may use some terms that people will find offensive today, but in order to explain this period adequately, I really do need to use them. So I apologize, I mean no offense. Secondly, during my coming out, I did see some Asian women in the bars, but I never saw a woman of color. So I don't know why. It was a white crowd. So I just thought I should address that. So when I was very young, I was desperate to meet women. Any woman with whom I might have sex and hopefully find a girlfriend. That was a problem. Since I was 14, I'd only been attracted to girls. I didn't know what it was. I only knew I desperately wanted to do it. I knew it was bad and perhaps even evil, but I had no idea of what I was or if I even existed beyond my own desires. What was wrong with me? Did I have sex? Yes. But it was very dangerous. I remember being 15 and sitting really closely to a girl and actually in a bar, drinking underage, which I shouldn't have been, but the girl was there. And this guy looked at me and he said, "Let's be friends and go homo." And I started, "Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean? I'm not. And I got all incredibly huffy about it in the whole thing. But secretly I knew that whatever he said, that I probably likely was a let's be friends and go homo. So what was a let's be friends? What was a homo? There was absolutely nobody to ask. The one thing that was kind of interesting when I did the walk for the Church-Wellesley Business Association in October was one of the guys I was walking with said, "Well, didn't you read Oscar Wilde in high school?" I said, "No." He said, "Weren't you exposed to the well of loneliness?" I said, "No, I didn't read that until I was like 24. And he said, "Well, how can that be?" And I said, "Where did you go to school?" And he said he went to Durham. And I didn't go to Durham. Like, we were reading Little Women and Hamlet and stuff like that. But I had absolutely no idea what was wrong with me. You know, this suppression of knowledge it's really reminded me a lot about what we're seeing in the trans community today, especially south of the border. It seems that they want to stifle any kind of talk or experience or education in that manner. And I don't think that that's the right thing to do, because what you end up with is a very, very, very confused young population. And these kids really do need to be educated, at least in my opinion. Keeping people ignorant will not help them. It will only damage them. It really sincerely will. Okay, end of rant. Okay, now, actually this is another rant. But the part I'm going to tell you about next might be triggering for some people who have had any issues with self-harming. So if that is the case with you, you might want to fast forward through the next bit, but then come back, okay? One night when I didn't even turn 16, no, I had just turned 16. I was at a house party and I caught who I thought was my girlfriend, at least the extreme object of my desires, in bed with a boyfriend. And I had grown up on a farm, and in part, and I knew what rutting was, so it wasn't like I didn't know what was going on. So I went into the bathroom with a beer bottle, smashed it, and slit my wrist. I was rushed to the hospital. They stitched me up and sent me home the next day. And when I was preparing for this talk tonight, for the first time in my life, I thought, why did they put me into a psych ward? At least to kind of figure out why such a young girl would slash her wrist so deeply. But they didn't. And maybe I might have found out what lesbian friends was if they put me in the psych ward. But anyway, once I got out, I went home. I packed a white Samsonite suitcase full of as many clothes as I could get. I went out the back door. I stuck my thumb out, had no money. I headed to Toronto, where I lived on the streets. Because the way I saw it is that if I didn't do this, I would be dead. So I found out about lesbian friends at a place called John's Open Kitchen. It was a real dump of sort of one of these short order kitchens, and it had a jukebox. And somebody put a quarter in, or maybe it was even a nickel, it was so long ago, and played the song by the Kinks, Lola. And when I heard girls will be boys and boys will be girls, the penny dropped, and I knew I was not the only person out there. And I will never forget the relief and sense of belonging to somebody or some other group other than me and my own weirdness. So that was fantastic. And then I got a job working in an outdoor mall on Yonge Street. It was kind of like the area down by the Metropolitan University now, only that has all the little food courts on it. But this was a little area full of stalls, and you'd go in and everybody was buying, it was still sort of post-hippie dippy time, and everybody was wearing those leather sandals with the thongs and incense and saffron and peppermints. And while I was there, I met a gay guy, and he brought me back to his home. And that's how I moved in with a group of gay men and one straight criminology student. So it was a collective, and it was gay, and it was highly political, and I was asked to move in, and it was great. I always, when people say, where were you raised? I say, I was raised by fags, and it's true. I learned so much about them, and unfortunately, all of them are dead now from AIDS, but back then, the prime thing I took away from them was a sense of close family, incredible resilience, and the importance of sex. That was the prime directive in the late 70s. Sex, 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 sex. You go get, it was sort of like, like war bonds, war bonds. In the late 70s, in the queer community, it was sex, 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 sex. So I had a problem though. The guys all had their haunts. They'd go out, they had cruise places. There were no cruise places for women that I knew of. So I thought, where are the girls? So off I went. Now, one of these places, which I sleuthed out, was, they used to have these old lesbian bars. They'd be full of stone butches and sort of Tammy, like they'd be wearing polyester suits with frilly shirts, and the girlfriends would be dressed like Tammy Wynette, and they'd be on their laps, and they'd be just, having a fine old time. And you couldn't come on to the Tammy Wynettes or you'd get punched out every single time. That was, you just didn't do that. As far as design, they were usually low-slung wooden tables with tons of ashtrays and cigarette butts and hurricane lamps. Mostly country music played, as I recall. I could still right now, if you'd like to hear, sing Hey Good Lookin'. Run, if I'm going to start singing. Hey, good looking. Oh, that's it. There was a place on Pape called the Blue Jay. It was a Legion Hall because there was a Canadian flag draped over the front door. But the Legionnaires rented it out on Saturday nights for the dykes to have a dance party, and. As I said before, the music was atrocious. But at any rate, you'd line up, you'd go in. I don't recall there being any kind of a cover charge, but you would certainly pay for it in terms of a beer. And then you'd go cruising around looking for chicks. And if you're really curious about this particular location, buy a copy of Any Other Way. It's a great queer anthology, and you can get it at Glad Day Bookstore, which is I believe, the world's oldest gay and lesbian bookstore. At this point in time, to my knowledge, at least there weren't any politically active groups. If there were, I wasn't part of them. There was, though, this one drag queen, and her name was Dolores. And she was quite glamorous. She was very statuesque, and she had the Tina Turner hair, and a silver lame dress, and pumps, and 2 bandoliers of bullets that were strapped around her body. And if any guys hassled her, she would whip off these bandoliers and beat them with it. And I thought, go Dolores! The first really, really nice club that I remember that welcomed lesbians was JoJo's. It was at the corner of Church and McGill. It's kind of an important corner from the point of view of queer history, because it was owned by Janko Naglick, who was one of the very first gay entrepreneurs in Toronto. And because first there was Le Cavalier, which was on the main floor, and then there was JoJo's on the second, and on the third it became the Barn. But the first was Le Cavalier, and it was an old style tea dance Nelly bar for the older crowd. For those of you who might not know what tea dance is a very, very big opportunity to go out and get hammered on Sunday afternoon and listen to really cute piano guys. But then I found out about JoJo's. I have to say I spent at least 2 years at JoJo's picking up chicks every night after work and dancing my ass off. It was fantastic. And the dyke fights were amazing. If you've seen any old westerns, or even some mafia movies today, but really the old westerns, those dykes, when they got going, the stone butches, you'd hear a bellow would come across the room. "You've been fucking my old lady!" And then all of a sudden, beer bottles would start flying across the room. And then there'd be smashing. And then I remember one time this big dyke jumped up and jumped onto the dance floor, grabbed somebody, pulled her off. Boom, 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 boom. And it was, maybe it's terrible of me to say it was exciting, but it was. But what the girls did, or the women, was we'd all run for the washrooms and cram ourselves into the stalls. I remember being in there with 4 or 5 in a stall, and people would be trying to get in underneath anyway, and we'd stamp on their hand and go, "Get your own stall." And then meanwhile, the gay men were screaming. They were all clones, which at that point in time was fashion code for gay men. And they'd wear checkered shirts, skin-tight Levi 501s, yellow construction boots. They'd have different polka dot handkerchiefs in their back pockets, signifying their sexual preferences. But anyway, they'd all start screaming and run to the door and get out going, "Dyke fight! Dyke fight! Dyke fight!" As I said before, it was dangerous, but it was also a lot of fun. And I was also still a teenager. Now, the decor of the place was really quite fabulous, and it was a major step up from the griminess of the Blue Jay and some of the other basement bars I'd been in, or basement hovels, shall we say. This place was really fabulous. It was really nicely decorated. It had a raised acrylic dance floor that pulsated with different colors. They had a DJ booth. DJ booths were just becoming very, very popular at the time. And one time I even saw Andrea Martin there from Second City dancing. I have no idea if she's queer or not, and I didn't care to ask, but it was kind of cool to see her there. Oh, and it also had, I saw my very first disco ball. The first time a lesbian dances under the disco ball is a wonderful thing. Now, gay men and gay women mixed very, very freely here. As I said, it was a ton of fun. And another spot, not too far away, that was of very great interest to me was the Club Baths. Now, the Club Baths it was a steam house, steam bath, and I gotten very, very interested in it, as had an awful lot of my other lesbian friends, because Bette Midler would sing, and Barry Manilow was accompanying her, and she was in this steam bath. And I thought, I want to go to a steam bath, because I've always been really, really against the idea that gay men should get to go places that gay women don't. I never liked that. I didn't like it then. I don't like it now. I will fight that. So I asked my friend Jerry, one of the guys in the collective, what to do. And he said, well, now we would call it, becoming a drag king. But that was, he taped down my tits. We put some socks in, painted on a little false mustache, put on the cap. And I got through the front door, and I was halfway down the hall when somebody went, Oh, somebody went, "Hey." I went, "Yeah?" And they said, "It's a woman." Ah. And then I got thrown out on my ass. But I didn't care because I'd gotten in. And it was very important to me to get in. It always has been. Now, a place I did get into was the barn. Same drag setup, same assist from my friend Jerry, right down to the chaps. I had the whole get-up, the whole, Leatherman look. And I even got as far as ordering a beer and standing around going, And then, but then somebody said, it was the same thing. "That's a bitch!" Out the door. But again, I didn't care as long as I got in. That was, very, very important to me. All right, well, I guess I'm digressing from my bar tour here a bit, but now at the same time, indicating yet another step up in terms of the socialization and acceptance of queers in the hospitality industry, shall we say, the Carriage House opened up. Now, the Carriage House is on Jarvis Street and south of Carlton. It was an old Art Deco hotel called Frontenac Arms. And a businessman, whose name I cannot recall, decided, "I'm going to make this into a queer bar." Back then, we would have said a homo bar. But yeah, because, he could see how many gay people were starting to come out of the twilight and wanted to have a place for recreation and to be seen. It was fabulous. It had plush brown sofas, a huge dance floor, a big disco ball. They had these great drinks called brown cows. They were Kahlua and milk, I believe. And they also, though, had a dress code, and they would not let women in who were wearing jeans because they didn't want, I will actually read what it says. "This was a code for lesbians of a certain style, often unwelcome in places affecting a high tone." So I affected a high tone and I got in. Yeah, I remember dancing my ass off in there so many nights. Great service, wonderful music. I first heard Love Hangover there. I tried poppers and promptly fell flat on the floor. I do not advise taking poppers. and I also met Gaetan Duguay there. He was known to a lot of people as patient zero during the AIDS crisis, and which has since been disproven, but what a heck of a nice guy. And we became quite good friends. And yeah, I was really sorry when I heard that he had died. Now, back in Toronto, there were political difficulties. The Butch and the Femme set hated us. I guess we were what you would call the precursor to the lipstick lesbians, or just sort of, just a definite movement away from that way of lesbian life. And straight men would frequent dyke bars in the hopes of finding a woman for sex. They all felt that women were either too ugly to fuck or they hadn't found the right guy yet. And man, it was fun. Again, back to Cathi having fun, but it was fun to see them tossed out physically right on their asses. And one thing I didn't mention back at the beginning with JoJo's was there was a period of time that they didn't want us in there. And they'd hiss at us dismissively and tell us to go away. But we didn't. We stayed. And eventually we coalesced together as a group. And if they really didn't want to go to JoJo's, say, or the Carriage House, then they would go to the St. Charles or to the Parkside. Now, the Parkside, the St. Charles, back when I was really young, it had two separate entryways. One was for women and escorts, the other was for men. In the back, there was the sort of the sex cave, which was, I never got in there. That was like this black room where the guys would go in and grope and fondle each other, and all sorts of people got busted by the cops back then. And back in the St. Charles, it was the same thing, women and escorts, and then just the local beer. And again, with me, I wanted to get in. So I got in. They had the most god-awful draft you could ever want, even though it was only 20 cents. But I thought it was about 15 cents too much. But the washrooms, when you went downstairs, the St. Charles must have been, once upon a time, a fabulous hotel because they had these beautiful, beautiful washrooms with huge waiting rooms with sofas. And I used to love just going down there and sitting there, and because the drag queens would all be down there. And they would be dressing up, doing their makeup, having cocktails, and they were really, really nice to me. And I just sit down there and visit with them. They'd want to do my makeup, and I didn't, nah, I don't wear makeup. But it was really quite subversive to be down there with those drag queens. On the second floor of the park side, there was sort of a series of different discos, we'll call them, because discos were just really coming into play at that time. They'd open at about 1 and they'd close at 6 in the morning. The first one that I ever remember was Mama Cooper's, and then it was the Milk Bar, and then it was Bimbo's, and I used to go to Bimbo's a lot because Bimbo's also had a spin-off fun things to do, like Bimbo's, like my friend Jerry called it Bimbo's Horror Cruise. And you'd get dressed up, and I remember going out and circling, we'd get all like seriously dressed up in finery and go out, all queers, and cruise around the islands. And I remember wanting to jump off once and have a swim, but then Jerry said, "You're going to get chewed up in the propellers," when I thought he was probably right. So I decided not to jump, but yeah. And then, so how it worked at Stages is that there used to be a stairwell that you'd go up, and it was up to the second floor, and it was packed. It was sort of like one of those old fire escape stairwells, and there was always a lineup that would go right out onto Yonge Street. You'd get in, and it was usually anywhere between $5 and $8 for a ticket. There was no booze, but they sold all sorts of different, sort of cocktails with fuzzy stuff. And you just dance until the sun came up. I always made sure I got out before then, but it was a wonderful, wonderful place and a very important part of the queer community. And it was also, if you're interested in this any further, you can look up DJ Denise Benson, because she does a lot of writing about the development of the queer community and the dance space. So I would recommend that as a good source if you have any interest. Speaking of DJs, there was another DJ at the time. She was DJ Julie Lee. And she and I had known each other since our street days in the 70s. And actually, we used to hitchhike together. I'm not sure what she's up to now, but she was a very, very big presence in the lesbian community in the 70s and the 80s. Just another sort of point of interest is that I do remember going to Starvin' Marvin's, which was a peep show on Yonge Street. And you would line up sort of like in front of a window, and you'd pay some money to see a girl strip. And I had a girlfriend who was a stripper. And so Pam was up there doing her thing. And then I looked over and I thought, it was Janice Cole. And I don't know how many of you, I imagine you would be though, are familiar with Holly Cole and Janice Dale. They're two of Canada's biggest documentary filmmakers. They did Prison for Women and Hookers on Davie. And there was Janice watching Holly strip. So now just north of Bimbo's, or where the Parkside was, there was a bar called The Quest. Actually, as a point of interest, in the late 80s, it was known as Robert Mann's Clothier, and who was a gay man, and I worked there when I was in university. And it was a great place to work, and he hired a lot of queer people. And the way the Quest was set up was, there was a bar on the main floor where you'd sit and have cocktails. On the second floor, there was a huge dance room. It had mirrors covering every wall. But first of all, you'd have cocktails downstairs, and it was served by a wonderful Mexican woman by the name of Marion, who was a painter, and a very, very fine one. So it was funny, because before, maybe it was a matter of aging, or getting older, but, we were all starting to talk more about art, politics, fashion, just bigger topics than we had addressed and I certainly was addressing in the Blue Jay because I was just trying to avoid getting punched. But yeah, but Marion was a very interesting woman. But then when you'd go upstairs, it was just like, because this was maybe 76, and everything was very much like Saturday Night Fever. That's how everybody dressed. And everybody danced, and we'd do the swirling and the spinning. And I remember going up on the afternoons when it was closed, but you could still, things were very different. It wasn't all locked up back then. And you could actually go up there. My friend Anne Marie and I used to go up and practice our dance moves for hours. So when I saw, you know, Saturday Night Fever, I could completely relate. Things were improving in the lesbian and I would say in the gay scene in general. They were incrementally on the rise. And the Metropolitan was the next place it opened. It was modeled on the New York scene. It was a very, very stylish eatery. Everybody went there for martinis and things like that, and like fancy snacks. And Carol Pope was always there. And that was usually the precursor, the place you'd go before you'd go dancing at Bimbo's. And then after that, and then in the early 80s, there was another establishment opened, again modeled on the New York scene, like the Saint and other restaurants like that. And it was called Bemelman's. And it was a beautiful, beautiful restaurant. And it was also cocaine central. It's too bad it was torn down because everybody would go there for brunch. And I'd never had, like, I thought it was so fancy to be drinking Henkeltrocken, you know, like you'd have that at brunch. And a lot of the people, and I was starting to work in higher end fashion, and so were a lot of my friends. And then at the same time, though, there was another bar scene that was happening, and it was at the Chamois. And that was on Hayden Street. And that was where Julie Lee, who I mentioned earlier, that's where she used to disco a lot. So you kind of had two competing scenes. One was more like the baseball dyke scene, and the other was the more sort of lipstick lesbian scene, or, you know, before lipstick lesbians were a thing, a scene. It was just sort of, it was different. The one thing about Bemelman's is that there was a lineup there every Sunday for brunch. You know, I used to go there with Robert Gage. He used to be like, he was a very, very high-end Toronto hairstylist, and he'd always be in there with his coterie. So you'd sort of go in and go, I picked up a girl there. It was also famous for doing lines in the men's washroom. Everybody went down to into the men's washroom and did lines on the back of the toilet. But I think it's just reflective of its time. Another place that I used to hang out at a lot was the Fiesta. And it was across from the Metro Resource Center. And it was owned and operated by Sandy Stagg, who was a key in establishing Toronto as a destination in the late 70s and early 80s. It was so cool. And they had the cutest waitresses, and they were so rude. I said, oh my God. I said, this is S&M service at its finest. And it was. And they had, the whole place was full of general idea art. You know, just everywhere you looked, like original pieces of general idea art. And quite frequently, you would see the guys in there. It was, again, this is sort of, it's interesting, you know, when you think back, because everything was blurring. It was sort of like, it didn't matter if you were gay. It didn't matter if you were straight. It just mattered if your interests met and you wanted to hang out in a similar environment and you were in like the same music or were interested in the same movies. It's just, it was really quite lovely, because I don't ever remember feeling like a lesbian friends and ostracized at that point in my life. Now, by this point in time, the Rose had shown up, and I did go to the Rose a few times on Parliament Street, and Julie Lee was the DJ there too. And it was fun, but I had settled down, so I wasn't going out as much as I used to, because you know what girlfriends are like, they're not into that. But there was one place, if you're talking about politics, it's important to mention, and that's the Fly By Night. And it's ironic where it was positioned, because there's Fillmore's, which is one of the like oldest strip joints in the city, which was just down on Dundas in Pembroke. And then in behind it, there was this somewhat dumpy bar called the Fly By Night. And I took my girlfriend at the time there because a friend had said, come, it's fun and it's different. It's different than what you're used to. So we walked in and it was just a big, and it was full of very aggressive political lesbians, very aggressive women. Like these were and I said at the beginning, I'm just using the terms that, you know, were used back then, but these were man-hating women. Like no man would ever go in there. And my girlfriend at the time, she wore makeup. And there were two huge pool tables, and we walked down the middle. There was a bar to the left, pool table to the right. And then when they got a look at Lori, they started going. And then my friend Nia came up to me and she said, get out. And I said, why? And she said, they don't approve of makeup. They do not approve of the objectification or the gaze, the male gaze on women. And they think that if you're wearing makeup, that you are encouraging the gaze. That's the first time I had ever heard of the gaze. But, you know, I'm sure these were very, very political lesbians. And we ran out of there because we thought they were going to beat the shit out of us. Frankly, I think everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but I don't approve of man-hating. I don't approve of trans-hating. I don't approve of hating anybody, you know. It's probably quite evident. I think we should all get along and try and have some fun. And the final place that I will mention that I did used to hang out at was called Together. And it was on Church Street, where the Black Eagle is now. And it was owned and operated, again, by Janko Naglick. And it was sort of more of a Cheers, you know, like the TV show, kind of place where lesbians and gay men would get together after work and have a beer. And we'd always end up talking politics, or generally. And one of the hot topics was the bathhouse raids. Another very hot topic was Anita Bryant and how we were all going to boycott Coors forever. And also, probably the most contentious one was Gerald Hannon, the late Gerald Hannon, I'm sad to say, wrote a very contentious article for Body Politic called Men Loving Boys Loving Men. Whew. Did we ever debate that one? And I'm not telling you what side I went for. And since then, I've been a serial monogamist. I went to university, became a writer, and that's all she wrote. Just in closing, I really wanted to thank the Church-Wellesley BIA for providing this opportunity to talk about my experience of being a lesbian from like 16 to now being a lesbian elder. Okay, thank you.